Whew, okay, so you've made it this far. We're going to talk about optional arguments for functions. And like I said, if you're kind of feeling maxed out, you can skip this one. This is just kind of a cool bonus. Totally not necessary for the kinds of stuff that we're going to do. But if you're trying to build software that's really usable in a deep kind of way, I think adding optional arguments can be really cool. And there are some examples in P5JS in processing. A good example would be the rectangle command, which lets you optionally specify rounded corners on stuff. And there's other examples of P5JS and processing commands like this. So let's go ahead and take a look together. We will see that in different programming languages, this is made easier or harder to do. JavaScript, I think, is somewhere kind of in the middle, though the way you write it is not the most intuitive. I don't love it. But let's take a look at an example. So let's, and before actually we write some code, let's kind of take a look at a hypothetical example. So let's say we want to create our own rectangle command in P5JS. Now, obviously one exists, but so we're going to call ours rectangle instead of rect. And the way it normally works here is you pass in an x, a y, a width, and a height. And then we would, let's say we were sort of adding a wrapper kind of around this existing one. Then we could say rect x, y, width, height. But maybe we want to make a smarter rectangle command that lets us either specify a width and a height, or if there's just a width, then it draws a square. And this would save us, a little typing and whatever, because obviously a square is just a rectangle with the same dimensions on both sides. We could do this in two ways. The first, which I think is a little more explicit, is to say that if height is missing, then we should draw it as a square. So the way we do that is we say inside here, we still need this. We'd say if h equals, it's the same as undefined. And undefined in JavaScript just means it exists or it has no value. Sorry, it doesn't exist or it has no value. And if that's the case, then we could say height equals width. And then we could leave it like this. So we're still drawing a rectangle with a width and height, but if height is missing, then we set height equal to width. And this is cool, but I think this like undefined part, it's just like, it's big, it's a little bloated. We got to have this whole if statement and whatever. I do think it's a little more readable, but I'll show you the way most people do this. And instead you would say height equals height or width. Now I know this is not easy to read. This is not super clear, but basically this does the same thing. This says height should either be equal to the height if it's present or set it equal to the width. Yeah, I know, not super intuitive, but let's see how we can use this in practice. Let's say we want to format, we've looked at some drawing examples. Let's say we want to format some text. We want to be able to print like a progress bar. We want to know what percentage of one number another number is. I know this is kind of a mathy example, but this is a pretty techie spot that we've ended up in here at the end of today. Again, if you're cool with just basic functions that don't need this extra stuff, go ahead and skip ahead here. So I'm gonna create some, we don't need a draw, so I'm gonna cut this out just so we're a little simpler. I'm gonna create a couple variables. Actually, I'm gonna copy paste them. So we've got them here. Cool. Okay. So I have a number called so far. That's how far I've gone so far. 42. I've got a total, which is 100. And I want to be able to print it with some decimal places. I want to be able to specify the precision of this percentage for it to be on screen. And actually, this is something I use a lot. It's telling me how far along something is. I'm going to go down below here and call this %done. We're going to pass in a number, the total, and the number of decimal places. And we're going to send back the result. So let's do it first without this argument is optional, then we can add it back in. So we're going to create a variable, and we're going to call that, we're going to use a command in P5JS called NF, which stands for number format. And what this does is it takes a number in, and we specify a certain precision for that number, and it gives it to us back. We can do that on both ends. It's called padding. So for example, decimal places here might look like this with zeros in the front. Those are called leading zeros. Or if it's decimal, these are trailing zeros. This is how many decimal places we're calculating to. So NF, and we're going to give it num divided by total. And we want, so that's the result. And then we want 0 additional numbers on the front end because we don't want it to look like this. And we want to do it decimal places at the end. Got to type it right. And then we can return the result. So a really good thing doing stuff like this is to do a little bit of coding and then verify, and then do it again and again like that, because otherwise, if you write your whole program, it's going to be really hard to tell where errors are happening. Do a little bit, check it, and keep that kind of process going. So I'm going to say console.log, and this is going to be %done. And you can even run a function here inside of another function. That's totally fine. Sometimes I think it's not as readable. And then I'm going to add the % like this. I can make this bigger because we're not going to draw anything for this. And so now, oh, oops, that's not correct. Some of you are probably screaming at your screen right now. That doesn't give us the percentage. So let's that % equal this, and it's this times 100. And I'm going to specify 100.0. This may or not be necessary depending on what's going on, but this is going to ensure that we get a decimal number and not, like a whole number, an integer. So now we're going to put % in here, and we get 42.0000% because we specified 4 decimal places. If we make this 2 decimal places, now it's going to give us 42.00. That's great. But let's say we want to make decimal places optional. Maybe this is like a thing that sometimes you want to do, but not always, and it's a pain to have to specify it or whatever. So we can add, just like up above, we can say decimal places equals the value of decimal places if it exists, otherwise 2, and 2 then becomes our default. So if this is specified, then use that, otherwise use 2. And so now, if I do this and remove that, now if I remove that argument and didn't have this, let's see what happens. Yeah, it's going to freak out. It's like, hey, we were expecting some extra stuff. You didn't have this here. Instead now, we get 42.0, and because that's the default, right? They're both the same. Let's change this back to 4. And now we get 2 different results depending on what we specify. So in this example, this is kind of mathy, but this is a good example of where you might use a function with optional arguments. Similarly, this kind of rectangle function where we're adding some kind of extra tweaks or functionality is really cool. Optional arguments and functions, not strictly necessary, but really nice. If you're working this week and using some functions and you want to try that, I think that could be really cool.